Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to check out, like, share, and subscribe. Check out my locals. Continued support is what keeps this channel going. So today we are going to talk about the second part of the Cratylus, the Plato's dialogue on names and etymologies, which, as we'll get to at the end, is really where he's introducing another one of his elements of the forms. So where we left off, Hermogenes had just been sort of convinced that naturalism was true, and that Cratylus was sort of riding high. But Plato's like, well, back up. Or Socrates is like, back up. We got some problems here. The first thing that we have is, well, all these people agree that by determining what the names mean of words, they can get some insight into the idea of the name makers, those people who are qualified to then make the names to describe things. What's interesting here is that Plato and the other Greeks are giving this the same level of weight and concern and consideration that Jews and Christians would give to understanding the etymologies and meanings of names in the Old and New Testaments. So if we were to like sort of overlay Plato's question onto that sort of Abrahamic system, we'd say that God is the name maker. And what we're trying to do is understand why God gives names to certain things. So it's an analogous concern for Plato and the Greeks to the Hebrew and the Christians. Now, what Plato will say, though, is that the ancients are wise and intelligent, but they're not divine. They can make mistakes, and he will go into some of those mistakes that he thinks they made. But what he does believe is that this is the way you understand what they thought words mean, and what they thought was true of reality by the way that they named the words. And so, well, we should look at that and take that as a very additional description of their own internal mental states. And because they were the best name givers, we should take them with respect, but we should also not take them as infallible. Again, that would be a difference between the Jew and the Christian who's reading the inspired scripture. And then we should then look at them and see if we can do better or find out where there's flaws there. So on that first point, is there anything you'd want to add, Logos?
I mean, I'm not a Christian or a Jew, so I don't know too much about that. But one thing that is interesting that stood out to me in what you were telling about that was when God gave Adam dominion over the animals, it isn't one of the first things that Adam got to do was name them all.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that might have some of the significance that you're talking about.
Well, exactly. Adam is sort of like a primordial name giver for the Hebrews and Christians. Andrew.
Yeah, and I think a very important contrast is that Plato in this dialogue is sort of emphasizing that there is an importance to names matching the underlying reality, which is sort of abandoned in sort of postmodern understandings of language and philosophy, that it's entirely constructed and arbitrary, and that it's still powerful, but the power resides in the language and names itself rather than them being in accord with the underlying reality.
Right. Now, once that consensus was reached, the dialogue then pivots and this is where a lot of scholarly debate lies. Plato then starts to criticize Cratylus's extreme naturalism. And then there's a debate on, well, is he abandoning naturalism entirely, or is he embracing a more moderate kind of naturalism? So what Cratylus says, he says two things. He says, one, that all names are absolutely accurately given to the things that they signify. And then he says that you can determine the meaning of a word by the string of its sounds. So then Socrates says, well, hold on a second. If the whole point of this dialogue was Hermogenes' name was not Hermogenes because it wasn't rightly given. So is that a wrongly given name, or does it signify nothing at all? And so what then Cratylus commits himself is to saying that it signifies nothing at all, which is kind of absurd. And then he goes on to this discussion about the Greek word skleros, which means hard. So he's saying that the R sound sounds hard and the L sounds soft, but skleros means hard. So if it means hard, but the string of sounds is one is hard, one is soft, how do we then determine that skleros means hard rather than something else or something soft? And so what he's saying is that, well, what we actually need here is a kind of convention. Convention helps cut the Gordian knot of skleros. and it helps us understand that the names can be inappropriately given. And to emphasize this point, he says, imagine if we have a painting of Cratylus, which is so accurate in every detail that it's identical to Cratylus. So we wouldn't actually have Cratylus in a painting of Cratylus, but two Cratyluses, which is absurd. And for a painting of Cratylus to be a good painting, it doesn't have to be identical to him. It has to be a sufficient enough representation of some element of him such that it clearly indicates who he is. Because if it's just a matter of names and being associated, then you could have a painting of someone else and say, well, that's Cratylus. But then it's not. And this is something you'll like, Logos. Socrates talks about numbers. He says that we have a fixed number of letters, but an infinite set of numbers. So then how do we name the numbers? Because we're going to run out of letters before we run out of numbers. So we're going to have some sort of convention where we agree that we're just going to keep on reusing certain iterations of number names in order to get to this. Now, this is not a radical conventionalism in the sense that we can just haphazardly slap things onto other things. Socrates is still committed in this dialogue to saying that names ought to point to something in particular, but there are certain limiting factors, such as names and numbers, or such as copies of the thing itself, in which case we're going to have some agreed upon convention of dealing with those limiting factors. So that's a kind of conventionalism that's not leading to epistemic uncertainty, like radical skepticism, or as you pointed out, Andrew, modern day skeptics. But it's saying that, well, the kind of one-to-one dimensionalism that Cratylus is talking about is logically problematic, if not impossible. This discussion also has a lot of relevant overlap with the discussion between the iconoclasts and the iconodules. Can you represent Christ in an image? Can you represent God the Father in an image? And to what extent is not capturing the thing sufficient that you're no longer pointing to the thing at all? Because even in that debate, there was certain agreement on what could not be depicted. The disagreement was, could we depict Christ sufficiently? So I think that's also really relevant to the Cratylus. So we'll first start with you, Logos. What are your thoughts on that?
I thought the comments on numbers were really, really interesting because it's true. Like, I don't know. It almost sounds like, I mean, they're not talking about different kinds of infinity here, so there's no Cantor diagonalization argument. But the idea that you're just going to run out of letters if you just keep trying to assign like each number a letter. But also, I was thinking about this morning, which is really interesting, right? Because I don't remember reading that part of the dialogue, but I actually was thinking about this in the shower. What if I was thinking about number systems that have digits higher than 10? So like hexadecimal systems use like letters once you start getting above 9. So it's like 9, A, B, C, and so on. And I thought, well, okay, so what if we start using letters as digits for numbers? And then what you do is you string letters together as if they're numbers. So like A, S, F, G, I would actually correspond to like numbers in each instantiation of the letter. And then what you could do is you could have naming conventions where you had like strings of letters for each number, which would be kind of interesting. I don't know how relevant that is. The fact that like we happen to think about it, with this dialogue at the same time, is just kind of interesting to me.
Right, Andrew.
So that's actually how Urbit internet addresses work. That each one is a number that is assigned a set of pronounceable letters that you then are able to pronounce, which is sort of interesting. But yeah, basically, I think that one of the key things that's happening here is that there is some elasticity or some slack between language and the underlying reality, but not infinitely so, right? So that, we use base 10, right? And that's how we're able to count hypothetically up to infinity. But at the same time, you could use another system like base 60 or these other things that we even see with dozens, right? And that we're able to do a complete and full mapping of this domain using language. And in some sense, they're all equally good, but there are sort of contingent or arbitrary things that they're causing it. And I think that that's sort of what he's getting at with the picture, right? Is that some parts can be arbitrary, but at the same time, you have to have a sufficient level of accuracy to fulfill it. And this is, like you said, the exact split between the iconoclasts and the iconodules, basically, right? Where the iconoclasts say that no, there's no, or it's not within human capability to do this for God. And the iconodules basically said yes, as long as you follow these rules, right? Roughly.
Right. And so like I said, there's an interesting interplay between this question that Plato's bringing up and then the question that's brought up in the later church debate. What you mentioned, Andrew, is the idea that there is some level of plasticity, but not infinitely. So this sort of reminded me of how history is different than fiction. So fiction is completely just, in its worst form, it's sort of like, fake histories that we got from the progressive authors in the 90s and early 2000s that were completely fictitious, made from whole cloth. Was that, history is a weapon, post-structuralism, we're just going to tell stories and superimpose them onto the historical record without any actual reference to it. I guess you could say those are hyper-real narratives. But the point is, though, it's totally plastic, whereas history is like, well, look, there is going to be debates on how we interpret given sets of events. But that's where the plasticity comes in, either because of differences in perspective, differences in amounts of information available to the historian. But what is a constraining factor on the plasticity is the commitment to what is real. And I think what separates Plato's statement here about a kind of moderate conventionalism is that it's not a gateway to infinite plasticity, because he still says that it ought to point to things that are real, but there are limiting factors involved in this naming process. And I think what's also interesting too is if we look at this from the point of view of from the Jewish Christian perspective as opposed to the Greek perspective, names are themselves not actually conventions, right? Because the Jewish Christian perspective is that the language is a result of a divine act at the Tower of Babel. So it wouldn't be conventionalism at all. It would be the intent of some divine intellect. And so the way the differences in words and languages would be explained some other way than just societal convention, which I think is an interesting way to look at how the Greeks are looking at this problem with words and names differently than Jews and Christians might. Logos.
It's interesting you should bring up the Tower of Babel, because I was actually going to ask you two about that. So, Adam names the animals. Ostensibly, he does it probably using some sounds and language or whatever, but he gives them some kind of names. Tower of Babel happens. When God splits the languages, does he split the languages in that the names are the same, but they're all different syllables? So people are like arguing over like nothing, in the sense that like we're talking about the same thing, but we don't know it because our syllables have all been scrambled? Or did God scramble the languages by scrambling people's understanding of the names and send them forth to kind of like go rediscover stuff? Like, what is the theological interpretation of that?
That's actually a really good question. I'll let you start with that, Andrew.
Sure. So it's not specified. It's just that specified that they were incomprehensible to each other. Based on, and I'm shooting from the hip here, I think that probably what happened wasn't just syllables being changed, because that is relatively easy to fix, right, or to relearn. But I think it was something more like a breaking of everyone's perspective, or a re-engagement, so that the people didn't have the ability to communicate those things anymore. With the Babel being the origin of human language, it's sort of ambiguous in the text, because there is, of course, the Tower of Babel, but there is also a discussion of the sons of Noah, basically going into what appear to be like language families. So both of these effects might have occurred, or one might have supplanted the other. The sort of sons of Noah model is more naturalistic, right, or more in accord with sort of a natural the common scientific theories of it. So that's my initial thoughts on that. I hope that's helpful.
Right. So, I mean, one way we could explain, I think that's, the sons of Noah would be before Genesis chapter 9, I think. We could say that there were related language families, like language families within, say, the Indo-European language group, and they differed in that in an analogous sense. But what happened was it was not only amplified within that language family, new language families were created, such that there were so many different starting axioms that these people were just like, man, this could take a long time to figure out, one way or the other. And I think another way in which a moderate conventionalism can be sustained is, I think, also in the dialogue they bring up foreign nations, like the Persians and the barbarians might have different names for man, for which in Greek is andros. But the point is, though, if we properly understand that what they mean by man is exactly what we, the Greeks, mean by man, then the fact that they are using some other word than andros doesn't negate the fact that there's a naturalism to the name. The reason why they use different letters and different pronunciations and sounds is because they come from different language family groups. But what still constrains them is that the Persian, the barbarian, and the Greek are all pointing to the same object called man. Logos.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So something I've been thinking about recently. It's interesting how this stuff just keeps coming up. Something I've been thinking about recently is like my views on morality, because I talk with people about my views on morality. And one thing I've said to kind of start clarifying things and put a finer point on things is that I consider myself kind of like a realist with respect to moral language, but maybe I'm not so much a realist when we get to like moral intuitions. And so what I mean by that, when I put the fine point on it, is that whatever your view on morality, I don't care if you're like an error theorist or if you're like a Bouye ethicist or if you're a realist or whatever, I think most people should agree. Notice the irony here, the meta irony. I think most people should agree. I'm giving like a should proposition here. That moral propositions are designed to get people to agree, right? This person's a murderer. That person shouldn't have done that thing. You should pay your parking tickets, right? Like the way moral propositions are encoded as if it's like looking for consensus to enact a set of moral rules. But if we have some like fundamental skepticism that moral propositions aren't interpreted equally by different, by mutual parties, well then there's no presumption at all for any sort of moral agreement whatsoever, because two people can hear the same proposition and think completely different things by it. They could agree to the proposition, but if they agree because they think it means different things, there should be no assumption that moral consensus is even possible given a set of moral rules, because we just don't have the structure to make it work. And so I think whatever your view on morality is, like in a Wittgensteinian sense, we want public rules that people agree or disagree with, follow or not follow. We want, like, if people disagree on a proposition, like say, I don't know, abortion, to throw out something really contentious, right? We don't want the disagreements to be like trivial in the sense that we mean the same thing but use different words, or we agree but use words differently. We want the people to understand the same meaning by the words and actually have a real robust disagreement about what's going on. We want the argument to mean something. And what you were talking about there just makes me think about that, how we really have to assume at least some kind of structure, at least in moral propositions. So
Well, not only that, like in the Kantian sense, when we talk about geometry, we already have to have a priori assumptions about spatial dimensions. And when we talk about time or mathematics, we have to have a priori conception of time. So we could argue from what you just said, if we talk about moral realities, which is the point that he eventually gets to, we have to assume there's an underlying a priori structure to these moral realities. That's a structure that he calls God. And he has a whole bunch of arguments for that. But that's the intuition that he's getting at. And I think the one that you're getting at, Andrew.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really strong point, right? That we we act as though there is going to be some underlying agreement besides just the power of the people at play for at least most moral systems. And that's a really interesting fact that has significant implications on what the underlying ontology of morality is, right? And it's not exactly like mathematics, but it's not entirely arbitrary like the syllables of a name. It's more like the concept of what is a man, right? And the other interesting thing is that some of these things are really clearly the same in every language, right? Like what is a man, right? But sometimes they make finer distinctions, right? Or slightly different groupings. The example is in some European languages, there's no distinct word between blue and green, right? And so some of these mappings are a little bit different, and it would be interesting what how that relates to this view as well, right? Of the question of natural kinds and whether language tends to end up having to map to natural kinds, or if it's possible for it to exist and not.
Right. Now, at the end of this is where we get this sort of little, introduction again to the idea of the forms. So Socrates says to Cratylus, well, look, if everything is flux, since it's already been demonstrated that Cratylus sort of thinks things are in flux, and Cratylus is also support. So Socrates is making the claim that the ancients made a mistake when they associated positive moral traits with change, flux, and negative moral traits with, being the same, static. And Cratylus is like, well, no, that's great. And Socrates said, well, hold on, we have a problem here, right? Because if the object the name signifies is always changing, then there is no thing for the name to point to, which then negates the entire point of naturalism because it isn't pointing to anything at all. And that's a real problem for the flux theory. And so Plato's like saying, well, hold on, there's also these intermediate inferences between the name given to a thing and the thing itself. So, you can say, well, we can't have a perfect representation of the thing. The name just points to it. And, whatever we conventionally determine to be a close enough description of the object, that's the name we're going to use. But there's these intermediations, which, of course, is where we can see from this is the idea of Plato's form and the idea of emanation from the forms, which we see that in a more fully described elsewhere. But I do, though, think that this is really important. If everything is flux, minimally, you can't be a strong naturalist like Cratylus is, because then there's nothing to point to. You could be something else. You could be a flux conventionalist, and that tends to be a more common matching up we have today. Logos.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. That's one of the big things that I've always been thinking about with this question is that, obviously, well, this actually gets back to the Phaedo, right? And Heraclitus and Parmenides, like you can't step into the same river twice, but also there is a river there, right? Like the water is different, so it's not the same way you step into it, but there is in some sense like the same river. Hey, where's the river? I want to go fishing. It's right over there. Well, how do you know it's right over there? It's not the same river. Okay, come on. We know there's like a same river there. So there's a sense in which things are changing, and there's a sense in which things are staying the same. And I think that's the real interesting point of dualism, right? Is to try to capture that dynamic. So people can argue about like philosophy of religion and things like that about dualism, mind body stuff like that. But like the more I think about it, the more I just think that dualism is just trying to capture those two fundamental notions that reality is always changing, but stuff about reality is also static at the same time. And it's the static parts that we can kind of name and talk about. And so, yeah, I don't remember reading that part like in explicit detail, but I think, yeah, I definitely agree with Socrates there.
All right, Andrew.
Yeah, and I think the fundamental thing, right, is that in some sense, one of the great dichotomies of ontology or of philosophy is is Socrates or is Plato right and things are fundamentally stable, or is Nietzsche right and stability is an illusion, right? And once you make that decision that there is actually underlying stability, it causes this entire cascade of necessary axioms. And I mean, it basically require it. Yeah, that's fundamentally it.
So yeah, the question then is, what does Plato leave us with in the mouth of Socrates at the end of this? Is he criticizing conventionalism? Is he criticizing naturalism? I think what we can say is he's criticizing extreme versions of both. One could argue that he's a moderate naturalist because he thinks that even if the copies are not perfect, they still have to point to the thing that they're referencing and not to something else. Or you could say he's a moderate conventionalist in the sense that he admits some level of plasticity. Given the two terms in play, and given that I think the pointing to the essence of a thing is more fundamental than acknowledging plasticity, I would call him a moderate naturalist. But I think also once we pull on the more developed Platonic thought of realism, Platonic realism, the idea that physical objects are themselves emanations of this divine reality, we could just say that what Plato outlines here in the Cratylus is his realism. The idea that this thing that the thing that all these other names are pointing to is the ideal form of all these things, but they're imperfect in the sense that they're deviations of a lower order from the thing that they're pointing to. So I would say either giving the terms in play, we would prefer to call Socrates here a moderate naturalist, or we could just say it's just an application to linguistics of Plato's realism, Logos.
Well, one interesting thing that I didn't remember seeing brought up enough in this discussion, and probably not because it's inconvenient for Plato, is recollection, right? So, like, if there are a bunch of a priori truths that we kind of remember, we knew already before we got here, why do we need more or less experienced namers? I mean, in the same way that Socrates could ask the slave boy in Meno a bunch of questions and get him to remember all sorts of things about triangles, why can't we just ask ourselves a bunch of interesting questions and just learn the true facts about names, right? If there's this divine reality of names, then it should be fair game for recollection. We should be able to access it the same way we access mathematical truths. And the fact that Plato didn't seem to really go there and really take advantage of that machinery that I saw, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I don't know how he expects that to fit with his broader philosophy.
That's okay. I'll give that to you first, Andrew.
Yeah, reading it seems like he actually believes that a lot of the underlying structures of the names of things are actually like mathematical truths that are discernible through reasoning and direct experience. So I agree with you, it's a problem, but I think it's a problem where he might actually imply that these connections of names can be more rigorously known than they actually can be. That's my initial thought on it.
So yeah, there's a couple ways we could look at this, right? Certainly, given that dialogues have an intended purpose, and much of the philosophical debate is what is that purpose. There are things that Plato just has to exclude in order to make the point that he's going to make. And so it might just be the case that he didn't bring up recollection because it just wasn't pertinent to the point he was trying to make, what I would call the moderate naturalist position that he's making. It could also be the fact that, as Andrew was saying, even though we can recollect, it's hard for us to recollect because of, we emanate further away from the divine essence. And this inquiry and this working our way back up to the one is a way of getting it. And then the implication being that the first men, if we say use the Republic, were the golden men. Yeah, it's a noble lie, I know, but maybe the first men were just better. They weren't infallible, but they were just better than we are at understanding names and things. He even says earlier on in the dialogue, maybe they talked to the gods. Maybe that's where they got the knowledge from. but then the gods can lie, as we read in the Republic. So we can't. I guess on the one hand, the name givers knew the gods, so that puts them in a position better than us. But when he throws shade at Homer and the Republic, he admits the gods can lie. So then, or at least the poets can lie. So then the question is, does he think they were talking to the kind of gods that he thinks were real, or the kind of gods that Homer thought were real? And the other one might just be this was written before he had developed the idea of recapitulation in the first place, and it wasn't included because he hadn't yet conceived of it. I don't know how early this is supposed to be in the Plato corpus. So, what do you think about that, Logan?
That's pretty interesting. Yeah, maybe we don't know the timeline, so I guess what we could do is just flip the hypothetical, I guess, and say, how might Plato have looked back on this dialogue given the rest of his thought that he developed? I think might be the interesting question then. So, um, I think so. Here's where things get really really weird, right? I don't know that we have to have like an authoritative first namers for things like math. I mean, we have some people that are better at math and can really help people learn math and things like this. We have the people that like first discover proofs and whatnot, but it's not as if there's like some class of people. It's more like there are individuals that like have talents, like a carpenter. Think of it like this, right? It's almost like the way he talks about names and the authoritative way he talks about names, it's almost like there's such thing as like a first carpenter or a first doctor or a first musician or like something like that. But it actually seems like if he wants to commit to the rest of his view that people have like latent talents for memory and some people are better at exercising them than others. Yeah, I don't know. Just trying to think about how you put all those views together is really interesting. I can't think through it all.
Well, the first X, that sounds very biblical, or at least in this case, it sounds very ancient. So both the pagans and the Jews thought that there had to be like a series of firsts, the first blacksmith, the first name giver, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One way, I guess, if we want to talk about how is it that you could have the need for name givers, but we all have this latent knowledge within us, is maybe we ought not to read the noble lie as a noble lie. Maybe there really were these gold men that were just closer to God in the sense that they were not as low down on the levels of emanation. And that these men, because they were closer to God in virtue of not having fallen down in the material world as much, had less clutter, less material clutter to get in the way of them tapping into their own true essences in a way that, say, like the bronze and the mud men would be too far away from. Now, that would seem to then contradict the Republic, because now it's no longer a noble lie. It's something that's believed to be real in order to explain this discrepancy. But that's one possibility. Andrew?
Yeah, I'm not really sure. This one doesn't have a clear answer to me yet.
This is not something I've been able to really put a lot of thought into, but one view out there is that this whole extended middle section on names and the meanings of names is sort of like a thesaurus for the rest of the Platonic dialogues. So, for example, we've been talking about how we incorporate the Cratylus into other dialogues. Well, there's one interpretation that says the Cratylus is the means by which all the other dialogues are understood, because all the words that Plato uses that are found in that etymological discursus ought to be understood in the way he described them there. So maybe the answer to your question is, Logos, we have to see how all the others can be interpreted and filtered through the Cratylus.
Yeah, that could be another question. Here's a better way of putting my question, I think, that might put more finer point on it. So Isaac Newton was famous for saying that, like, when he discovered or invented calculus, that he didn't do it himself. He stood on the shoulders of giants. And there's this understanding that even as like a priori as math is, there's the sense in which we actually learn more as we do more. But the sense I get from reading this dialogue is actually things work in reverse. We actually got names more right than not the first time, and people be screwing it up as we go like through the generations. And so it seems like, I don't know, like insofar as the names of these representations of this divine reality, how does Plato see math the same way, given that we seem to like learn more and do better at math? Uh, Maybe Plato just thinks it's a matter of discipline. Maybe Plato has this implicit assumption that people know that like you can get math wrong. And what Plato is really trying to tell us maybe is that people don't have this underlying discipline when it comes to talking about things or naming things. Language is a plaything for people to an extent. We always have more ebonics and slangs and things like that in our language that change the way we talk all the time. And insofar as language is a people's plaything and not something like abstract and like rigid like math, that might be the danger of the corruption as Plato sees it. And that actually leads me to like another interesting question about the Tower of Babel, right? So this one just kind of blew my mind a few minutes ago when I was thinking about this. So we know that there are multiple ways that God can like carry out judgment in the Bible. Like he can actually like send angels or do things himself, like Sodom and Gomorrah or something. But he can also just like let nature run its course in the case of like, say, I don't know, Israel and Babylon or some of the other places that captured Israel. Um, Now, looking at what's going on today, because it's almost like the elephant in the room, right? We're talking about this dialogue where people are like, yeah, we can just arbitrarily call things what we want, right? I see you and Andrew joking about certain things in the chat. Um, there's a lot of stuff going on today. And the more we see society kind of like urbanizing and people like gather in one place, we're seeing cliques within cliques and people like inventing their own languages for things. And we're seeing like multiple different kinds of news sources and worldviews, and people are kind of like having their own facts, so to speak. Now, what the Tower of Babel could be saying, in part, is that because everybody's gathering in this one place, it's you're getting like this ultra clickiness, and then there's like an explosion where people just like see the world differently because they talk about things so much differently, kind of like we're seeing now. And what the Bible describes is like this cascade effect of that happening, which also might be why the Bible is not so big on cities. I mean, I know that's got other reasons too, but that might be an implicit one, is that cities have a really accelerating effect on this. So, I mean, I know that put a lot together, but what do you guys think about that?
I'll let you answer that first, Andrew.
Yeah, I think that this is actually touching on something, right? That might be actually one of the consequences of fallen human nature and how it interacts with our ability for language and culture and other things.
So, what I would say is that one way is if once Adam sinned and sin into the world, the subjection of nature in Hebrews 8, God imposing death as a consequence for, well, I guess you could say maybe this is a consequence of Adam's disobedience. But when God actively intervenes, like say in the Tower of Babel, as a kind of, it's not so. There's a certain way of viewing God's miracles and God's direct interventions as a sort of like there's a natural way things are going, and then God just kind of steps in and just like breaks all the rules for no good reason, and then steps out again. I think, well, at least when it comes to judgments, a better way to look at it is that he's an accelerant. So he'll come in and just find this thing and then just sort of press the acceleration button on it, and then it just kind of goes off. Or with like the punishment of natural processes like plagues or invading armies, given that there's this indeterminacy to events at a certain level, until you get to time t, where time t is the instant this event happens, there are presumably other ways it could have happened. God acts as a constraining force so that when it does finally get to time t is the way he wanted it to be. Or as you said, is it a kind of karmic cycle that's built into the universe? You just do X and Y happens, and that was a part of the framework of the entire universe that was set up. So thoughts on that, Logos?
Yeah, I mean that basically is getting at the point. And not to diverge the discussion from Plato from the Bible too much, but I think putting it together, really, I think if we put all these dialogues together in a giant meta discussion, what Plato is cheekily getting at here is just the way human beings implicitly discipline themselves and see things. Math is seen as this thing that you can't get wrong. Well, you can get wrong, sorry, for now. I mean, of course, you have the whole 2 + 2 = 5 movement and stuff going on Twitter, but for the most part, math was seen as like this can't touch this first principles kind of abstract thing. And it's only here's what's really, really interesting. This is blowing my mind right now, right? It's only after you have this postmodern movement to collapse everything to language, including math, do we see math start doing a whole bunch of crazy stuff? And we see this stuff start really creeping into math and the sciences and so on. Because if you can reduce everything to language, then we get these issues. But if there's this first principle divine work of language that Plato is kind of like alluding to, I would think that language and naming would be kind of like another quasi fortress against such things, kind of like math was, in the same way that everybody seems to implicitly connect math with recollection, the soul, and so on. Maybe this whole thing is some roundabout contradictory way of, not contradictory, but like tongue-in-cheek way of Plato just saying that maybe it doesn't work like we think it works. Because if it did, here's what we'd expect. But here's the crazy stuff we're even seeing in this dialogue, and the crazy arguments that people are making in this dialogue. So I don't know.
One thing I want to add to is as to your explanation or your mentioning of the perceived difficulty of meshing the cradle with the idea of recapitulation or recollection, rather. I'm not entirely sure Plato here is saying that the original name givers were the best in an absolute sense. The impression that I get is that the Athens of his day is in some sense degenerated, and that they're inferior to the original name givers, but presumably truth seekers like himself are able to continue the process more adequately than the current day Athenians. So it's not that they're the best because they're necessarily sometime in the past, as if being old necessarily makes you better, because he seems to be criticizing the ancients for identifying everything with flux, which he gets to the head with this criticism with Cratylus himself. But more like, well, Athens is kind of degenerate right now, and so yeah, they're worse than the ancient name givers. And when we start fixing this mess, the mess that you're talking about degenerated language, we need to start with them because they were just less degenerated. Not necessarily because they were older, but just because they could actually name things correctly, and we could talk about things. Logo.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I guess that gets to another interesting kind of meta question, right? So it seems to me that language naming and conventions are the types of things that we go back and fix. Now, this actually reminds me of a time in math where we actually did have to go back and fix something, not quite to the degree that Socrates is implying, but when you're talking about limits, we were a little cavalier, fast and loose with limits. And I'd say the 1700s, maybe early 1800s, before Cauchy showed up and had to like redo the whole thing. And I'm sure one or both of you have heard the whole story where, Cauchy actually, did this formal restructuring of limits. They followed certain rules. You couldn't like treat them like 0 for one proof and non-zero for another proof and so on. And Cauchy's teaching of limits was so advanced in principle and abstract and difficult that like his students tried to kill him. Like they revolted and tried to kill him. But that's to say that it's interesting that where math is fragile is when math acts like this fast and loose language. Like we found this concept, let's just talk about it like it's the wild, wild west and see what happens. And when math is more sure, we don't treat things like some language we can just kind of like play with as we go. We treat things as like these rules we have to follow in this system. And so when thinking about this meta issue, like language is this thing we clean up, math is this thing that we, by and large recollect and don't. It does seem that there is some kind of dividing line being pointed to there. And when the two mix, problems happen. And going back to my previous comment, like given the present day and age where people want to deconstruct everything to language and social conventions, that's kind of like accelerating the problems that we had back in the past.
Okay, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the major themes of the Socratic dialogues, is that sophistry is dangerous, right? And I think that's the key thing, is that if we use language as precisely as mathematicians use mathematics, right, using some of the tools that Plato and Aristotle came up with, we might be a lot closer to understanding the underlying web of names than we are now, right? And part of that you can sort of see in the philosophical tradition, realist philosophical traditions, right? That they have rather elaborate, I'll call them name webs, that in some sense rival the elaborateness of mathematics.
Right. Now, one of the things that I would want to say is from the Christian perspective, I would want to say that if we want to use, the project you just mentioned, Andrew, having very precise names for things so that we can avoid a lot of these pitfalls and make the naming of things more like the naming of mathematical concepts. I think what I would like to say is that the sort of one-to-one correspondence that Plato is trying to find, we would find for those things that were named in Scripture, but of course Scripture doesn't name all things, so then we have to then build a web out from there. But the naming of things, what I would want to say is whatever sort of tight web of names we give, we go from certain, of course, certain within the context of human interpretation, but we know at least, we assume at least within the source material that it's certain. The only uncertainty is any disagreements of our interpretation. And then from there we build out. And so where that would be different than Plato, because he seems to be critical of the original name givers, is that within the Jewish Christian tradition, and presumably even the Islamic tradition, we would say that all of these names were correctly given the first time. And now we just need to understand that better and then expand the name web. So, Logos.
Yeah, not being a Jew or a Christian, I'll pass this one to Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, and this will come down to how one looks at special revelation, right? Is that the so one problem. Okay, so here's the problem, right? So assume the name web given in Scripture is perfect, right? The issue is for us to be able to understand that there needs to be a correspondence in ourselves, right? And so not only is there great effort to expand it outside of the special revelation, but there will be great effort to just get into the appropriate space to understand that, right? So even if you have, for example, a set of mathematical proofs of like every mathematical concept in modern mathematics, it takes, at this point it would take more scholarly effort to understand those than anyone has in a single lifetime. And I think that that's part of the issue, right? Is that in order to even get what is in special revelation, you need a lot of effort, and you need a entire society that is doing this in such a way that it's transmitted, and that you have these experts with it in it, right? Outside of like supernatural grace, right? Because if you have supernatural grace, I mean, then it doesn't really matter. You can get the right thing from special revelation or general revelation with the least effort.
Yeah. So, is there anything you want to say more, Logos, or have we covered the topic? Do you think?
Yeah, I think I talked about all my little flashes of insight we had through this conversation in the last week or so. I don't know. It's just really, really interesting how these random topics I was thinking about over the past week just like came to fruition in the topic. It's weird how language is like underpins so many things. I mean, I guess here's another interesting thing to think about, right? One of the first dialogues we talked about was justice, right? That dialogue about justice, not the apology, but the one where it talked about like, is justice to be found in a wise man? Is it to be found in the
Wasn't that the
citizenry?
Phaedo?
Huh?
Wasn't that the Phaedo?
No, not the Phaedo. This was well
Oh,
before
the
the Phaedo.
Credo.
The Credo. Yeah. Yeah, that one, right? Now imagine the effect of language interplaying with that dialogue. Because you know me, I'm all about the meta. I like to see about how things interplay with other things. How does this interplay with the Meno? How does this interplay with the Phaedo? How does this interplay with the dialogue on justice, right? So like let's just think about this. Let's think about like justice in the sense of moral language and like all the different options there were in that dialogue. Like they all had their own problems individually that we talked about at the time. Now imagine slipping language into this, right? So let's suppose you have like one wise man that's supposed to like distribute justice. But like you have to assume that there's some kind of a moral language there by which the justice is distributed. And so like him and the mob or the citizenry, whoever, have to understand it on roughly equal terms. Or if the citizenry is supposed to distribute justice, this is like really, really important for our day, right? If the citizenry is supposed to distribute justice, we have to make sure that they're speaking the same language. Now, here's an interesting thing, right? The very fact that Plato and Socrates had to like have this dialogue about language in the first place might be pointing to the fact that it was a cultural problem of his day, right? Now, if it was a cultural problem of his day, so people were playing fast and loose with language, it stands to reason they might be playing fast and loose with moral language. And if they are, then how could you trust the citizenry to mete out proper justice if it's not even clear they're speaking on the same moral terms? You see what I'm getting at here? This is like a really interesting dynamic to think about.
Yeah, Andrew.
Yeah, definitely. And this is sort of the it's basically a bootstrap problem, right? That you're sort of stuck in the cycle that if you don't know what is good and just, you aren't able to describe it. And if you're not able to describe it, you can't articulate it to others, so you can't get it, right?
Exactly.
Well, we can, I think, minimally say that there was a stream of people like that, the sophists. They're common recurring villains in the Platonic dialogues. And given that Socrates generally is trying to refute them by in a sense, by appealing to some sort of moderate naturalism, that's probably given that his enemies are the sophists, who are these completely conventionalists, radical conventionalists, that it's probably safer to view him as a moderate naturalist. But so yeah, now that we are about out of time, Logos, do you have any final thoughts you want to end with before we pass it on to Andrew?
No, I think that basically did it. Just think about when thinking about Platonic dialogues, I find it best not just to think about one dialogue as its own little vacuum to analyze. Always think about the dialogue relative to the other dialogues. And I think that's where you get like the most interesting like cascades of thought.
All right, Andrew.
Yeah, I think the key thing that we didn't cover is that this very deep wish to engage with the true names of things is a theme that you even see in the sort of pagan Levantine culture that's around the Hebrews, and that we see in like religious accounts of the Canaanites, that in order to engage in like a contract with a spirit or a deity, you have to know its true name. And the other thing that we didn't really get into is that God, in his revelation to Abraham and to Moses, sort of doesn't give his true name, at least to Moses, right? He says, "I am who I am." Um, and that's a really interesting distinction of God's behavior compared to what would be expected of a pagan deity in the same time and place.
All right. Thank you, Logos. Thank you, Andrew. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.